Last fall, we launched our podcast, In These Times, with an examination of COVID-19 and its far-reaching impacts. This season, we're focusing on Black lives and exploring the nation's complex history with race.
We want to start with a horrific shooting rampage in Georgia that has left 8 people dead. CBS News has learned that President Biden has been briefed on the attacks.
6 of the 8 dead are said to be Asian women, but investigators have not said whether or not the attacks are racially motivated.
As we worked on our third episode, the news broke about the shooting in Atlanta that left 8 people dead, including 6 women of Asian descent. This tragic event comes after more than a year of rising violence against members of Asian, Asian American, and Pacific Islander communities.
The group Stop AAPI Hate says there have been nearly 3,800 reported racist attacks on the community since March of 2020, back when the coronavirus pandemic began.
They started calling me Ching Chong, Chinese virus, just all sorts of nasty stuff. They eventually struck me on my face. I fell down to the ground.
In this bonus episode, we talked to Josephine Park, professor and undergraduate chair of English and director of the Asian American Studies program, about the shooting, the history of anti-Asian racism in U.S. politics and culture, and the formation of the Asian American identity as an explicitly political act.
It's been very hard. I have to say that it's dredging up actually a lot of memories that I don't often think of on a day-to-day, but I heard, and it's clearly dredging up memories for everybody in the Asian American community. And I happened to hear a reporter, I think on CNN, talking about some of the racism she and her family experienced when she was a child, just triggered, I suppose, by the events. And I found myself going back over that too. You know, I mean, the name calling, tires slashed, I mean, all that stuff happened. And it was hard. It was really hard. And I think it's actually so welcome to talk about that struggle. And it's just been really kind of amazing to see all these personalities come out and say, oh yeah, of course this happened to me. And I think a thing that at least I know our students encounter, which still surprises me, is a lot of their Asian American students say, you know, my friends who aren't Asian American, and even some who are, don't actually believe I've encountered any racism. And I think, really? They don't believe that? And now I think everyone believes it. So yeah, it's bringing up some very painful memories. But I've been appreciating all of that kind of welling up in our culture.
Professor Park says that anti-Asian racism and anti-Black racism spring from the same well of white supremacy.
In some ways, it's very simple, like anti-Asian racism and anti-Black racism, they both work toward white supremacy. Those are both key elements of it. Both are at kind of high water marks of nativism in our country's history. You'll see, incredible rise in anti-Asian, obviously, anti-Semitism. I mean, they all correspond. So on some level, it's very obvious. On another level, there's some interesting and sometimes difficult mediation that's happening.
Racism against Asian and Black populations can play out differently and serve to pit minority communities against each other.
One thing that's also very obvious about this country is that racism is black and white, or is understood to be black and white in this country, and in many ways is. Although I will say, with the new visibility and I think a major shift in the national and cultural conversation in the wake of the Atlanta shootings, I feel a change in that, to be honest. But back to the primary structuring of black and white, I think that the Asians have been targeted as a model minority, and that phrase is also useful. because it's a model minority as opposed to other minorities. So the model minority pits Asians against other minority groups, and typically, I mean, in its first uses in the 1960s, it was quite deliberately used to pathologize African Americans. So here we have a model minority as opposed to this other minority that is repudiated. And so that positioning of Asians relative to blacks was a part of a kind of a disciplinary strategy, and to argue that, oh, you know, you saw lots of examples then. Look at these, look at this model minority. They don't need any handouts. They don't need any help, and we can abuse them terribly and they'll be fine. And so it was to valorize this one group, which actually had no access to, you know, government assistance in many cases. You know, that was a kind of a way of stigmatizing other minority populations.
Professor Park explains that the development of the Asian American cultural and political identity happened in the 1960s and 70s, drawing inspiration from models of African American political solidarity and cultural formation. Claiming an Asian American identity was a deliberate choice, she says, because there is no shared history, culture, or language that intrinsically binds the community together.
If we think of Asian Americans, I mean, they hail from, you know, South Asia, the Pacific. You know, it's vast, geographically vast. So the only common bond is racism. So it's that we've been lumped together in America. That's Asian America. And I always like to explain to my students kind of the difference between an ethnic and a racial identity. So for my ethnic identity would be Korean American, but one of the criticisms of that kind of ethnic claiming, it's a kind of liberal identity but that's very universalizing, which has its purposes, but that means, oh, I'm Chinese American, I'm Irish American, we all have hyphens, and that's fine. But the formation of Asian America was an explicitly racial formation and not an ethnic marker. So the point was that Asians of all different stripes would band together for common cause, to use the language of today, to be seen and to be heard and to have a political voice.
That political voice developed in response to political and foreign policy actions, including the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which held into the U.S. and China were allies in World War II. But the start of the war precipitated another act of violence, the imprisonment of American citizens of Japanese descent.
Evacuation. More than 100,000 men, women, and children, all of Japanese ancestry, removed from their homes in the Pacific Coast states to wartime communities established in out-of-the-way places. Their evacuation did not imply individual disloyalty, but was ordered to reduce a military hazard at a time when danger of invasion was great. 2/3 of the evacuees are American citizens by right of birth. The rest are their Japanese-born parents and grandparents.
Because our experience is so governed by foreign policy objectives, there's very little assumption of being American, because we're constantly shackled to countries of origin and some not even origin, because we're racialized and lumped together in different ways. And I will say this most recent attack of, the China virus, that's very clearly a foreign policy objective. So you see that anti-Asian racism and anti-Chinese presentation of the virus as like a foreign contagion, that was like an active part of government management of this crisis, obviously at the very, very highest level. And you see the repercussions of that management in day-to-day with an attack on Asian people all over this country.
COVID, to be specific, COVID-19, that name gets further and further away from China as opposed to calling it the Chinese virus. By the way, it's a disease, without question, has more names than any disease in history. I can name Kung Flu. I can name 19 different versions of names.
Professor Park draws a straight line from the racist rhetoric about the coronavirus and the rise of violence against Asian Americans.
There's like a total correspondence. It's very clear. This goes back to what I said a little earlier about many people seeming not to acknowledge anti-Asian racism, which I think it's almost funny to me. It's kind of like gaslighting. I mean, I think you heard him say Kung Flu, right? What do you think that is? And what are the repercussions of that? And, when it's being actively promulgated at the highest levels and all through Trump's party. So you will still hear, it's not like it's gone away with the end of his regime. So it's an active strategy and it works.
Professor Park's teaching centers around those foreign policy objectives that impacted the lives of Asian Americans. Her Asian American literature course is organized around three key moments in American history: the Chinese Exclusion Act, the annexation of the Philippines, and Japanese internment.
So those are my three cases, and then there are a lot of really key literary texts that demonstrate the cultural presentation and expression and the lived experience. All of those, what it was like to be a colonial subject in the Philippines, what it was like to be detained in Angel Island because you were excluded entry, and what it was like to be asked to leave your country during internment. And so with those three frames, I then look at kind of different ethnic groups who have come to the U.S., and we use those three frames to kind of map out their experiences along that kind of landscape I've set up.
She also teaches modernist poetry, a literary movement that responds to the ideological and cultural shifts relating to the Industrial Revolution and the two world wars. The writer who first drew Park to the field is Ezra Pound, a major poetic figure who was also a fascist who supported Hitler. He participated in what scholars now call Orientalism, the practice of exoticizing and essentializing depictions of the East by Western writers and artists.
It's hard to find a more significant figure in American literature for the 20th century, but as my viewpoints have kind of changed as our world has changed, and I find his views now so repugnant. Now, I will say his Orientalism is actually very interesting in that Pound's obsession with the Orient is often trotted out by Poundian scholars to actually kind of save Pound, because he really did respect Chinese literature. He actually called himself a Confucian. So when he was detained during World War II, that's what he told the chaplain. So it was a very serious engagement with him, and he was very impatient with the kind of Orientalism he saw that preceded him and that was still kind of rife in his period. And so Pound's Orient is actually a means of retrieving him. Having said that, I don't like to try to retrieve him, and I see a lot of resonances between the Pound during World War II and in its wake and the Proud Boys, and this kind of really violent insurrection against the government. And of course, the racism and the anti-Semitism, it's just so repugnant. And, I sometimes, I think, people fall in and out of the literary canon. And personally, I'm okay if Pound's peer HD, if we read her and not Pound, that's cool. And I'm teaching an American poetry seminar right now, and for the first time in this kind of advanced level, he's not on the syllabus. Although I talk about his influence a lot, and I think he's incredibly important. I just decided I didn't have the stomach to read him this semester.
As soon as news of the Atlanta shooting spread, so did debate about labeling the murders a hate crime. Cherokee County officials made statements indicating that the shooter did not offer race as a motivation.
He claims that these, and as the chief said, this is still early, but he does claim that it was not racially motivated. He apparently has an issue, what he considers a sex addiction, and sees these locations as something that allows him to go to these places, and it's a temptation for him that he wanted to eliminate. He understood the gravity of it, and he was pretty much fed up and kind of at the end of his rope, and yesterday was a really bad day for him, and this is what he did.
These statements were met with immediate backlash, with Asian American activists speaking out about the relationship between racism and misogyny.
It's kind of impossible to separate. It's hard to know how you would say, I actually can't understand the argument that it is separate. So yeah, that's actually even hard for me to fathom. I mean, obviously if you want to try to kind of rescue this very troubled young man who murdered these people, I suppose that's a tactic, but I don't otherwise see how you could make that claim. First of all, there is a long-standing kind of Western cultural practice of feminizing and eroticizing the East. And I mean, you could go back to kind of our ancient Mediterranean origins for that. So there's that. But in the American context, when I mentioned before this 20th century history of hot wars in the Far East, one of the repercussions or maybe byproducts of that warfare was an intimacy between American soldiers and local populations. And during the Korean War, but especially during Vietnam, you see the active deployment of local women to kind of host these American soldiers. Although I should say, there are also many genuine connections, of course, between soldiers and local populations. This always happens. And so, so much of Asian America is a product of these kind of now, familial connections between Americans and local Asian populations. And so, but with the kind of the hyper-militarization of these spaces and the way in which American soldiers were kind of serviced through these R&R facilities throughout Asia during the war in Vietnam is kind of the rise of the modern industry in a global way, really dates from that period. And so, many people in the wake of the shootings in Atlanta have cited those horrible clips from Full Metal Jacket and the presentation of the prostitute in that. And, that's a kind of very common and dominant kind of caricature that's widespread and an assumption in our culture.
Professor Park points to the reluctance to call the shootings a hate crime as part of the larger issue of denying anti-Asian racism.
It's really astonishing. And as I mentioned before, it's like this gaslighting is kind of unbelievable. And so not to acknowledge, this is a kind of high order case of not acknowledging racism, not saying what it is. And, the damage of that is so intense, and it's a kind of personal burden that I think all of us share. So it's, and I've talked to them during this whole kind of year of horror with this kind of anti-Asian racism as a product of this virus. I've talked to so many other faculty members, students who actually feel a sense of shame when they experience racism. And in so many ways, I think it's because it has not been acknowledged more generally. And so there's often this sense of kind of self-implication. Did I do something, or am I misreading? You end up trying to work it through yourself when it wasn't your fault, And so when it's not labeled what it is as a racist attack, it actually kind of plunges you into this turmoil of trying to figure out what it could be.
Too many Asian Americans have been walking up and down the streets and worrying, waking up each morning the past year feeling their safety and the safety of their loved ones are at stake. They've been attacked, blamed, scapegoated, and harassed. They've been verbally assaulted, physically assaulted, killed. The conversation we had today with the AAPI leaders and that we're hearing all across the country is that hate and violence often hide in plain sight. It's often met with silence. That's been true throughout our history. But that has to change because our silence is complicity.
I'll say, too, just how moved I've been by our current president's rhetoric and the speeches that he's given about anti-Asian racism and the kind of forthright decision to acknowledge that. I mean, it's not that I'm often moved by presidential speeches, but it really was kind of profound to hear this addressed when, after 4 years of that other guy, it is such a relief.
This concludes our bonus episode, Atlanta and the History of Anti-Asian Violence. We'll be back next week with episode 3, Institutionalizing Racism, where we'll hear from a sociologist about residential segregation and drop in on a conversation between 2 criminologists about police reform. In These Times is a production of Penn Arts and Sciences. A special thanks to Professor Josephine Park. I'm Alex Schein. Thanks for listening. Be sure to subscribe to the Omnia podcast by Penn Arts and Sciences on Apple iTunes or wherever you find your podcasts to listen to all 6 episodes of Season 2 of In These Times, Black Lives and the Call for Justice.